Good morning, everyone. Thanks to organizers for letting us to participate in this magnificent meeting. Our presentation is entitled Learning to be Domestic, the Earliest Houses in the Eastern Slopes of the Southern Andes and Fama, Argentina. Around 200 BC to 100 AD, durable residential structures were built for the first time in Anfama, a humid valley in the scarcely analyzed eastern slopes of the South Andes. The emergence of built environments implied the development of a new social universe within which people, houses, plants, objects, and regional exchange networks were articulated. This process has traditionally been known as the regional formative period. We present a case study discussing the diverse relations between mobility strategies, built environments, and human material interactions. But what do we mean with learning to be domestic? Domestication has been used with multiple meanings, from the evolutionary transformation of the genetic composition of plants and animals through growing codependency relations with human beings to a mental, structural, and social process related to neolithization. Especially in this last sense, the term is usually accompanied by a classic idea of village life, where the presence of residential nucleations, productive spaces dedicated to agriculture and grazing, and special communitarian features should be observed. On the other hand, the emergence of domestic, whose most concrete materiality are the houses, would have implied a series of social, economic, and adaptive changes. Nevertheless, these changes are often understood in the terms of the process in their final shape, rather than the multiple, provisional, and non-directional experience articulated in the earliest moment of this changing world. In this presentation, domestic refers to a strictly material aspect. Taking an etymological sense of the word, domestic relates or belongs to domus, the house. From our point of view, dwellings, houses, or residences are built environments where quotidian activities repeatedly take place. These built places make up assemblages of people, objects, animal relationships, and ideas that are co-constituted to generate a landscape that is dual, disassembled, and reassembled cyclically. In this way, we consider that the emergence and development of domestic life should be understood as particular processes according to the negotiations that may have been generated between people and other entities considered as active participants in social life. The nature and timing of the adoption and spread of agriculture and sedentism in northwest Argentina are still unclear. The archaeological evidence previous to 500 BC is scarce outside the Andean highlands of the Puna. Despite the scientific biases that have limited research on hunter-gatherers from the valleys, there is no evidence of hunter-gatherers dwellings structures in our region. After 500 BC, Aero-Passer groups began to expand and settle within discrete territories. But the idea we have of the early villages of the region was built from the archaeological evidence of 300 to 800 AD settlements, varying clusters of the same design of house compounds. Circular or subcircular semi-subterranean roofed buildings ranging in size between 2 and 20 meters. These buildings were placed around a single circular and roofed patio defined by large upright stones. At times, other irregular and larger structures were attached to the unroofed courtyard. Quotidian activities as food preparation and cooking, resting, flint knapping, and weaving were carried out in the peripheral buildings. Some of them could also be used as stores for corn or potatoes. At the patios, it is common the presence of cist burials containing one or more dead ancestors and their offerings. These stone chambers occupied a central space in the structures and protruded over the occupational floors, being a close presence for daily life. The architectural attributes can vary from case to case, but the house always showed the same appearance: a single, isolated unit of coarse and irregular walls to the outdoors and strong and solid walls making a smooth and regular surface to the indoors, formal entrances and pathways. Indoor features and activity areas would also vary. Nevertheless, these elements are always show the same spatial distribution. Access to the house is made via the circular patio, and movements are organized by features placed in the center points of enclosures. The material settings created within the residence could be understood as planned and restricted scenarios where human practice and bodies were limited, oriented, allowed, or forbidden to move, access, perceive, or remember some places, humans, or objects. This particular material configuration was not restricted to a single area. It is a widespread way of building a house recorded on the alluvial fans of Tafi Valley, Yocavil Valley, the higher but nearby ravines of Los Corrales and La Ciénega, and the eastern basins of the Anfama and Upper Menira rivers. Nevertheless, this image is not necessarily representative of the earliest village experiences. The remains of these early occupations are difficult to find or were removed by later and more intensive occupations. The three archaeological sites we present here provide us scattered bionic evidence of how remains that tell us about people moving through the landscapes, the increased commitment with some places, and the growing dependency with objects and food.
Situated on the eastern slope of the Andes, the Cumbres Calchaquíes and its adjacent valleys are one of the main areas for the development of early village in northwest Argentina. In this contribution, we consider the case of Anfama Valley. Anfama is a riverine basin of the Yungas ecoregion, specifically its higher component, the montane forest, ranging in height between 1,300 and 2,500 meters above sea level. The topography is steep with deep gorge where numerous streams flow, forming the Anfama River basin. The flat terrain is restricted to hilltops and several narrow terraces near the streams, all conditions that difficult intensive agriculture and large and clustered settlements. Still, this zone receives regular and abundant summer rainfall, allowing for small-scale dryland farming. Archaeologically, the ecoregion of the Yungas in northwest of Argentina has been conceived in two ways: as a marginal area on development produced in the upper areas of mesothermal valleys and Puna, or as a border of cultural tradition between the Amazonian and Andean worlds. In recent decades, new researches have deepened the study of different sectors of the Yungas, generating a revisionist view of the cultural development of pre-Hispanic periods. Our team has carried out systematic excavation in the Anfama Basin, identifying a long human occupation that, in the pre-Hispanic period, ranged from 500 BC to 1500 AD. Taking into account that we are interested in the earliest moment of such occupations, we will focus on the evidence that comes from early domestic dwellings that has been recorded both on hilltops and on terraces in the basin. El Sunchal and Casa Pastor correspond to isolated residential units on terraces with multiple reoccupations and modifications. And Mortero Quebrado is a flat hilltop where 7 residential complexes were built. The daily practices of this pre-village population are still poorly known for the region. However, in the south of the Cumbres Calchaquíes, new researchers and data will mark a process of growing territoriality around 200 and 100 BC, expressed in burial sites, in urn and cists, but without information regarding architectural structures. In this sense, a rescue intervention carried out by our team has offered important evidence in order to bring us closer to the first regional houses. In Casa Pastor site, we identified a structure of circular morphology calibrated with major probability to 200 BC to 50 BC. The walls were a very uniform single row of small stones of 40 centimeters of height, perhaps complemented by walls made of perishable materials. The excavation provided pottery fragments, obsidian, and other lithic knapping debitage, grinding stones, and macrobotanical remains. The presence of obsidian, whose Puna sources are more than 200 kilometers away, and silica of non-local origin would imply consolidated exchange networks in which camelids would have played a major role. Also, the macrobotanical evidence of Chaniar allow us to think about nearby displacements of less than 15 kilometers for its harvesting, and seasonal movements because Chaniar fruits during late spring. The pottery is entirely crude, with thick sand inclusions, oxidizing firings, and occasionally careful smooths, but one of the fragments presents a subtle representation of a camelid, which suggests the early importance of these animals for the Anfama Valley and perhaps raising the possibility of caravan traffic from this early stage. The material culture recovered in Casa Pastor allows to establish a universe of objects very similar to that which will be observed in later occupations, including pottery, obsidian, silica and quartz tools, and grinding stones. However, the presence of architecture with a low investment in work and whose need for maintenance would be recurrent allow us to think of a non-permanent occupation. Other elements like carved stones and pottery fragments recovered by the family that owned the current house would allow us to think of later reoccupations of the same sector throughout the first millennium AD. This point is especially relevant since in other Anfama sites such as El Sunchal and Mortero Quebrado, we also observe the presence of recurrences in the use of certain spaces and architectural palimpsest at a later stage, remembering us that domestic stories are not static, with occupations, abandonments, partial or total demolitions, and new constructions.
Mortero Quebrado is another site that presents evidence of early occupation in the Anfama area. It's located in the top hill along a narrow edge that connects the valley bottom to high grassland, quartz outcrops, guanaco herds, and paces to higher valleys of Tafí and Yocavil. 7 complex residential compounds distributed over 500 meters were identified, with an architectural pattern similar to that mentioned above in the South Calchaquí area. Stratigraphy and radiocarbon datings carried out so far in 3 of the 7 units allow us to identify that Mortero Quebrado presents a main occupation in 100 and 600 AD. In the free excavate unit, set of material linked to domestic practice were identified, such as passive and active grading artifacts, lithic instruments made in quartz, quartzite, and obsidian, ordinary ceramics, and micro and macro remains of cultivated and wild vegetables. Also, in Mortero Quebrado, as in other archaeological sites of Anfama, entropically intertwined rocks were identified. The investment in the construction of the wall and roof of the Mortero Quebrado structures, as well as the recovered material assemblage and the location of the site in a transit sector with access to important resources, allow interpreting Mortero Quebrado as a residential site with permanently occupied dwellings. Nevertheless, excavation in Mortero Quebrado provide relevant evidence for the topic discussed here. In all the enclosures we recovered, multiple pits carved beneath the occupational floors. 22 of these features were identified. We want to highlight the context of the pit number 5, located in the west portion of the central enclosure of Unit 4. It made up of a feature of a circular mouth and flare section and have 110 centimeters deep. It had 4 medium-large flagstones overlapping as a cover, and other medium-small flat rock delimiting its mouth and internal walls. Near this pit, to the center of the wall, a large polished and engraved block with zoanthropomorphic figures overlapping was identified. The fill of the pit number 5 consists of 5 layers with a large amount of charcoal and ash. Among the layers were recovered ceramic fragments, partly sooty, that made up a large urn, a fragment of a fine ceramic bowl with post-fracture wear, quartz flakes, and active and passive grading artifact will remain useful life. The base of the pit presents a thin layer that, of very plastic clay that contains large remains of charcoal. Its use can be associated with a storage structure, although its morphology, content, and the positional characteristics do not allow to rule out the possibility of having been an humanoid structure similar to a cista emptied before the abandonment of the house. The remarkable thing about this pit is that its deepest layer was dated between 600 and 400 BC, being one of the earliest dated from Anfama and the surrounding sector. If it is taken into account that the occupational floor of or other pits of Mortero Quebrado were dating between 100 and 600 AD, a difference of more than 500 years between the base of the pit number 5 and the main occupation of the site is observed. So this makes us think of early mode of use of domestic space that perhaps being in different ways that they could later be present. The number of the pits and the ubiquity in the house suggests that their formation must have constituted a repeat practice over time. They were certainly part of recurring action, although not daily. It could be interpreted that Mortero Quebrado sector could be initially occupied in a non-permanent way, with the excavation of pits in the bedrock that could serve as a cache places, ceremonial places, or territorial marks for groups with great mobility in the landscape. With the passage of the time and the recognition of the use in transit through the sector, more permanent structures could have been built with great work investment. Such a structure with strong stone walls would came to occupy previously inhabited space that were kept in the collective memory through the pits that could have been made regularly from early moments. This interpretation can be reinforced if we remember that Mortero Quebrado is located in a sector of passage toward higher space with resource and transit transit roads to other environments, which will make it a recurring inhabited place with territorial relevance for the pre-Hispanic communities of Anfama. Although further research and analysis is required to confirm this hypothesis, the early dating of pit number 5 of Unit 4 and the subsequent main occupation of Mortero Quebrado lead us to think about possible alternative processes where domestic space were built through recurring action over time.
A third early occupation detected in Anfama is in the site El Sunchal. This site is in an alluvial terrace and presents multiple evidences from different occupational moments, from 50 years BC to 800 years AD. Through the different excavations, we were able to detect a residential complex that shows occupation spanning more than 800 years, at which went through processes of abandonment and reoccupation that destroyed part of the previous structures and remodeled the site. The constructive and temporal difference between the overlaid structures in El Sunchal allow us to establish that the first house was constructed 50 years BC and abandoned sometime between 150 and 200 years AD. Around 350 years AD, new inhabitants built another house, but in this presentation, we consider the third construction. The first occupation consisted in a circular enclosure built with flagstone hammered in the floor. Probably this enclosure was roofed with perishable materials. In the east, this space is connected through a door with another big enclosure that we define it as a residential courtyard or patio. The north wall was removed during a later occupation. Excavation provides similar evidence to other early sites: pottery fragments, granite stones, lithic artifacts, and carved stones. The pottery is mostly crude, although here, unlike in sectors such as Casa Pastor, there are also pieces in reducing firings, fine finish, and decorated. The pottery assemblage was abundant but fragmented. The reconstruction of the vessel morphologies allow us to recognize 9 different types of parts. These include spherical pot or pucos, bottles, spherical or subspherical contorted vessel with restricted necks, and bowls. We can infer that this pottery assemblage has performative characteristics that fit with cooking and serving solid and liquid food, rather than storage. The analysis of pottery inclusion shows that they were elaborated using local clays. This and the presence of lithic artifacts used to smooth out the vessel surface suggests that the ceramic was produced in this site and not brought from another space. Connecting this first occupation in El Sunchal with the other early occupations in Anfama, we detected 2 sculpted rocks. One was a rectangular tabular piece of small dimensions with hemispherical engraving, and the other a phallic representation. For the topic that we are discussing here, it's very important to consider the practice related to obtaining and processing food. Vegetable resources don't usually persist in the Anfama archaeological record, but in another place that we consider as a trash place, we could detect 2 burned vegetable macro remains. These were identified with CMIs and fasciole vulgaris. Other information was obtained through micro-remain analysis that evidenced the manipulation and consumption of corn, squash, and bean. This information is important because in Anfama we couldn't detect agricultural structures like in other formative sites, but we can identify cultivated vegetables. The grinding stones consist in 2 flat mills and 6 hand stones designed to produce different types of processed food and in different quantities. The presence of these instruments is remarkable as is evidence of strengthening the links between humans and plants and the growth in the use of cultivated products. With respect to the consumption of manipulation of animals, the situation is similar. The bones don't survive their geological record, there are pastoral structures, and we can only infer some information through the lithic artifacts. The lithic groups include artifacts destined to hand and processed animals. In the early occupation, we identify obsidian and quartz projectile points to hunt small animals and birds, and stone with natural cutting edge probably used to cut and process meat. El Sunchal can be interpreted as a residential site that went through different moments of occupation and that evidence a repeated use of the same locations. Comparing the earliest occupation with Mortero Quebrado and Casa Pastor, El Sunchal shows a growing local production of ceramic container and lithic instruments. The consumption of domestic vegetable products, probably cultivated in the adjacent terrace, evidence new relations with space, a long permanence in the same place, and the development of care and dependence relationships with the cultivated vegetables. Discussion. At the moment, we have 10 radiocarbon dates which prove that around 2,000 years before present, a dozen of house compounds were built in the sites Casa Pastor, El Sunchal, and Mortero Quebrado. However, if we consider that the interrelation between architectural, ceramic, and carved stones patterns are repeated in other sites in Anfama, such as La Larga, Loma Bola, El Duraznillo, La Perijita, El Potrerillo, and others, the number of houses built for this period could be as high as several dozen. The construction of several domestic compounds with a greater constructive investment in a relatively short period of time will allow us to think that the experience of the early houses satisfied their original promoters, who decided to establish themselves with a greater degree of recurrence in Anfama. But this process did not follow a single path of development. It was expressed in ways of being domestic, which in some points are similar and in others show particularities. At the spatial level, different choices can be observed. Some of them use the lower terraces with reduced slopes, like Casa Pastor and El Sunchal, while others prefer high and steep sectors of Anfama, like Mortero Quebrado. In the cases of Mortero Quebrado and El Sunchal, the history of housing presents an occupational continuum from 50 BC to 400 AD. Nevertheless, the Unit 4 in Mortero Quebrado and Casa Pastor shows that this process could have started previously, from 600 to 300 BC, in a growing commitment with the use of certain place. Some of the pits carved beneath the occupational floors were already present 400 years before the earliest evidences of circular architecture. We consider the possibility that this kind of pit could be part of other structures that disappear during subsequent construction events. But the main and remarkable issue is the growing relation with this place, a returning point in the landscape where material elements, objects, food, or even corpus were stored. Comparing the material assemblage, we observe that although the houses become more solid around the 1st century AD, and elements such as the carved rocks and storage wells appear, which would mark a growing process of territorialization. The radiocarbon and stratigraphic evidence show that this was not necessarily a linear process. The life story of the houses was not homogeneous. In the case of Casa Pastor, we observe a structure used presumably for a short time and then abandoned. In El Sunchal, a house was built, abandoned, and then rebuilt a few centuries later. And in Mortero Quebrado, we observe a greater degree of occupational continuity than in the other sites. There, the spatial recurrence was accompanied by the development of several residential complex nearby. Recovered materials such as obsidian, silica, and wilfrite pose a scenario in which the medium and long distance mobility network observed around the 3rd and 1st century BC, remaining in force at least until 600 AD. This practice will be maintained during the occupation in the 1st millennium AD, incorporating other elements such as copper mineral beads, construction pattern, a relatively common ceramic style, and carved stones. In relation to this, in the vast majority of sites are anthropically intervened rocks. These artifacts present inside houses or in high visibility open spaces are similar to the huancas present in other sites in the Southern Andes during the 1st centuries AD. Their presence can be associated with domestic ritual practice that allowed the generation of marks in the daily landscape as a form of territorialization, in turn serving as conflict negotiation entities and preventing the formation of hierarchical structures. In this way, the intervened rocks reinforce and maintain the autonomy of the domestic groups. If we turn our viewpoint to a larger scope, we can see that the whole early village landscape in the study area was built as an assemblage composed by the aggregation of singular residential compounds like those we have described above. The expansion of villager settlements during the 1st millennium was enabled by environmental conditions favorable for agropastoral adaptations, including higher amounts of annual precipitation and vegetal species variability. But it was a slow and non-directional process, with ephemeral proof for subsistence and mobility strategies. Some of them maintained, reproduced, and enhanced, and others abandoned. The main elements we recognize are much more mobility than expected, within a framework of recurrence place being occupied and reoccupied, increasing commitment with an intervention or certain locations, and growing mutual relations of dependency with material, culture, and certain produced fuel. Consequently, the scale in which the villages were formed and reproduced was fragmented. Settlements layout do not show centralized planning. Central spaces, as plazas or most ordering the space, are not present. Moreover, in several South Andean cases, residential sites tending to spread out along the landscape, keeping considerable distances between houses and fields, precluding the formation of really large and clustered village settlements. This process drove complex demographic trends that include the development of densely inhabited regions but with scattered and spatial youth. To conclude, we observe that a conjunction of elements present in early occupations, mobility, recurrent practice, and dependence on object and domestic vegetables, allowed the development of a new landscape organization that will crystallize in village life. However, this new way of life would not have similar characteristics in the different environments of the Southern Andes. The case of ANFAMA contributes to thinking about this variability of paths followed by the first domestic groups, taking into account experimentation, regression, and change as important factors. Thanks.